This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, and Giovanni.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. Thank you for joining us today. With me is my co-host, Kagan. Hey, man. How you doing?
Doing well.
And we are here to talk with authors and journalists Suzanne Gordon and Steve Early. They join us today to discuss their new book, Our Veterans: Winners, Losers, Friends, and Enemies on the New Terrain of Veterans Affairs. Steve and Suzanne, how are you both doing this evening?
Very good, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, we're so excited to be with you again. It's great.
Yeah, it's been quite a while since we talked about your earlier book, Wounds of War. So I'd like to get in with both of you a little bit about kind of the origins of this book, and especially about that this book really kind of carves out some new terrain vis-a-vis the physical injuries, mental, emotional, psychological injuries, and creating those different nexus between them, especially when it comes to things like environmental stuff, Agent Orange, burn pits, things like that. Um, Will you share with the listeners about how you guys came to write this book, and what was the big targets you had as far as subjects and things you wanted to cover?
Well, both of us, there's three authors of the book, and one of the authors is a younger journalist, Jasper Craven, who talks about military stuff in VA, and none of us are veterans. Steve and I think of us as ourselves, I think, as veterans of various anti-war movements. I mean, my interest in American foreign policy started when I went to school in 1963 during the Vietnam War. And, I suddenly became very aware of American military and foreign policy and have been thinking about these issues ever since. I'm also a healthcare journalist and a researcher and have spent years and years, really decades, researching healthcare systems and experiences of patients in private sector healthcare, and concerned about our profit-driven system. And in the the aughts, I guess, I began to look at the VA system and did some work in some VAs, and was finally decided I wanted to write a book about VA healthcare system, the Veterans Health Administration, which is the largest healthcare system in the country, the only publicly funded, fully integrated system. So I spent, 5 or 6 years researching that and going into VA facilities with veterans, and who were amazingly generous, I went with veterans to psychiatric appointments and primary care appointments and oncology appointments and end of life discussions. It was really extraordinary. And, I went around the country, and, so I became very, very aware of the veteran experience and the kinds of wounds of war that they had, and also the wounds that I describe and that I focus on and that we focus on in the book isn't just people who go into combat. Because, the military, as my friend Rick Weidman, who was a Vietnam veteran and legislative director for a long time of the Vietnam Veterans of America, says the military is a collection of very dangerous occupations, no matter where you are. And one of the things I'm always trying to remind people of is, they think veteran injuries, combat, well, you don't have to leave the continental United States to get PTSD or military sexual trauma or suffer from all kinds of, back, neck, shoulder injuries, etc. So I think Steve, I kind of corralled into, I'm Steve's my husband, so I would talk about veterans. I helped found a group called the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. So my life is pretty much 24/7 veteran stuff, and it just seemed logical to look beyond the healthcare issues and look at what military service really involves, what sacrifices are kind of necessary and unpreventable, and what
Right.
what the military is like as an employer, and then look at the way our society constructs the veteran experience. What are the promises we make and what are the promises we keep and mostly don't keep? Um, and I think Steve probably could add a lot because he has a slightly different, coming to it from a different perspective.
Though I've been a freelance journalist full time for the last few years and done some previous books about labor issues, my background's been primarily in the labor movement and was a longtime national organizer and rep for the Communication Workers of America. And before that, in the 1970s, worked with labor organizations, including coal miners and steel workers and Teamsters. So as long as go as long ago as 50 years, what I noticed when I got involved in union stuff was the really important role that military veterans played in particular unions and their struggles. The first union I worked for, the United Mine Workers, back in the early 70s, was a scene of an incredibly important history-making rank and file struggle for union democracy and reform. A group called the Miners for Democracy ousted the corrupt, entrenched, murderous old leadership of the coal miners union, and that reform was led by a guy named Arnold Miller, who was a survivor of the D-Day invasion and a wounded World War II veteran, a Korean War veteran by the name of Harry Patrick. The campaign to transform the Union was led by Vietnam era veterans, came back, went to work as coal miners. One of them, Cecil Roberts, who I worked with back then, is still the national president of the UMW. And so I was impressed from my first involvement in labor struggles, uh, what a catalytic and critical role military veterans can bring because they bring leadership and ability to work as part of a team, to take risks, to stand up for their rights, and help their fellow union members who sometimes hold back, uh, fight back. And in my own work over the years with in the telecommunications industry in the Northeast, I worked on a number of strikes and tough bargaining situations, contract campaigns with members of both the communication workers and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And again, same experience. Uh, some of the people who were the most effective picket captains, the most effective organizers of mobile picketing, the best strike leaders were people, uh, you know, who were from backgrounds, went into the military, got out of the military, went to work for a phone company. And so, what I contributed to the book was, some of the sections that deal with is why the labor movement should make greater use of the 1 million men and women served in the military and are now members, a wide range of unions. And we could talk more about unions that are doing a good job of deploying them at home and the ones that need to do a better job.
I would I would imagine that the synergy between union members and union members, in terms of understanding this is similar struggles, dealing with unsafe workplaces, dealing with not being paid enough or having the work you're doing not being counted as pay. Um, and we talked about this just a little bit offline, but that the U.S. military, it is in fact illegal. It is against federal law for military members to participate in any kind of union, anything that even seems like a union. There's all kinds of official organizations. The Association of the United States Army comes to mind of different things you can join, and they do advocate to a certain extent on benefits and work conditions and things like that. But it's nothing at all compared to genuine die in the wool union membership where people really actually get to push back on that. Um especially, with the military, that um it's long known alongside, horrible corporate interests as far as how much they're making their people work for how little wages. Um, and you see that dichotomy play out on a bigger scale because of that, like here in Portland, people fighting, trying to get higher wages. I think Amazon here is paying $18 an hour or something like that, starting out. And for some people, it's still not enough. It's still not enough to take care of their basic needs. And it's also come out a lot more in the last few years that the military does not do as much intrinsic good for their members and their families that they could, in terms of, different aspects of being in service. So, I don't, to me, and not just as a veteran, but as a human being, it's really shameful that there are soldiers that have to rely on food stamps. That there are situations where, usually the soldier, the service member, their doctor is easily accessible, or hopefully not too inaccessible. But for the spouse, for kids, the military health system has shrunk however much in the last, what, 5 to 10 years. Horrible cuts going on. Um, but we're supposed to buy in. Those things are just little inconveniences. Those are little things that we just need to accept. We have to accept that spouses are going to move long distances and have horrible times getting new jobs, which is something that, it's not a new problem, and yet Uncle Sam still does almost nothing. And to switch gears a little bit on that topic, that the about safety conscious, that the military is exempt from so many different regulations and rules that normal businesses that or bigger corporations would have the EPA up their asses, and yet for the military, it's not so much a thing. But that also extends over to families and children, that what's happening, what has been happening the last couple of years in Red Hill and in Hawaii, what's been happening at Camp Lejeune the last 50 years. I'm fairly certain that the water that I drank at Fort Lewis was contaminated in one way or another, and that possibly my then spouse and my young son was living near there, that they may have been drinking the same stuff. These are all horrible things that the military just kind of shushes away, and we're supposed to be okay with it. And I have my own moral reasons for saying I don't think people should serve in the military anymore. But if they're going to serve, these things should be there. These things should be, it should be thought of that way. How shameful is it that people's kids can get poisoned by living on a military post?
Well, one bright spot is that as a result of uh, kind of a policy shift from the Justice Department under Biden earlier this year, really for the first time since the 1970s, there's been a serious effort to unionize members of the National Guard in at least two states, Texas and Connecticut. As you mentioned, the Pentagon reacted rather negatively to the efforts as part of the GI anti-war movement in the late 60s or 70s to form an American Servicemen's Union. Uh, and despite some brave efforts by its organizers, that way activity was quickly criminalized. And so active duty folks, as you note, have been denied an organizational voice. And but in these two National Guard organizing campaigns, particularly the one in Texas, you could see what having a union style organization or just a more informal soldiers association to address bad working conditions and uh, benefits being taken away and low pay. The Texas National Guard organizing that my union, the CWA, is backing through the Texas State Employees Union was triggered by Governor Abbott as a political stunt, sending 10,000 Texas Guard members to the border and 1,000 applied for hardship waivers. Those were denied. He had tens of millions of dollars to spend on this stunt to help get himself reelected. But at the same time, he was imposing this unexpected duty on many Guard members and their families. He was cutting tuition assistance, one of the main reasons that, one of the benefits that people join the National Guard, Texas and other states. So there's some terrific people leading that effort. They're now called the Military Caucus of the Texas State Employees Union. You can check out what they're doing on the TSEU website. And they can't collectively bargain. They're not going to strike. Regular public employees aren't allowed to do that in Texas, but now they have a voice. They're going to be very active in legislative political affairs, lobbying the state legislature, and putting pressure on a Republican governor who just, wanted to use them as political props with really adverse impact on their regular jobs and on their National Guard service. I mean, they want to be serving people, not, you know, acting as mall cops on the border.
I mean, I think that, one of the big problems that I see is that we have this view of military service and sacrifice, like you guys signed up to die for your country, right? Well, I mean, obviously that's true, right? I mean, the military isn't the Peace Corps or a Meritor. It's about killing people and getting killed, right? I mean, which is another thing that we stress in the book, I mean, I'm very taken with the work of a famous Canadian sociologist called Irving Goffman, who developed this idea of total institutions, institutions that totally control every single thing about you. And the military is the quintessential total institution. And military indoctrination is all about teaching people to forget what they were taught from the time they were born, that you shouldn't kill people, right? And also, you know, um, and also to obey orders, right? And I think that um, the thing that we also forget is that it's a job. I mean, being in the military is like a job, and um, and it should have rights. It should have the same rights as other jobs, but also, you know, the sacrifices that people make should be reasonable, right? I mean, we shouldn't be sending people to unnecessary military adventures and putting them in harm's way, but also we shouldn't be subjugating people. I mean, to moldy housing, or as you say, moving people around so that they can't have a dual income, which you need, particularly given how poorly the military is paid. I mean, 126 military bases in the U.S. are contaminated with I can't even pronounce it. Perfluorinated carbons, and there people are surrounded by predatory lenders. I mean, we interviewed a guy in the Navy, Kagan, you would know about this, who, a guy in San Diego, Jose Caballero, who basically talked about, these 18-year-old kids getting these bonuses, and then the Navy lets these car dealers come in to the ship, and they sign on to, buy these expensive cars, and then they can't pay them off, and then then they are told, well, you're never going to be able to pay this off, and baby, you better re-up. I mean, in Iraq, the scandal of pits, right? It's just unbelievable. I mean, you hire a contractor who has Kellogg Brown and Root, known in Vietnam as burn and loot or bribe and lie, and and they use a 15th century method of, just burning everything, and you're all breathing this stuff in, even people who aren't in combat. I mean, the 3M earplugs, that you all were given, and they didn't, the Pentagon somehow couldn't be bothered to figure out, like, where did they work? And people have tinnitus and hearing loss, and they thought they wouldn't using these things. I mean, one could just kind of go on and on. And, I think, I mean, particularly for women, the misogyny in the military that the military refuses to deal with, and the military sexual trauma and the way that people are penalized, with bad paper discharges if they report a commander. So I mean, I think these are preventable harms. You know what I mean? They are preventable harms, and we as an American public should know more about them. We should know more about what military service involves, because if you don't know what military service involves, then you don't understand the veteran's experience, because it begins in the military. And Henry, you mentioned the military health system. I mean, we're very focused on VA privatization. They have privatized the military health system and shrunk it. This is and in spite of vast every year increases in the budget for the military, and they can't afford the military health system. Like, excuse me, really?
I had made a note for in terms of this discussion that the something I think that advocates should begin talking about is that when the NDAA comes around for a given year, when we have our big budget that comes around in a given fiscal year, let's say, recently we've gotten to, I think it's over 800 billion now. So if $800 billion is our military budget, our reactive or preventative, however we're deciding to define defense on that particular day. If we're willing to put out $800 billion, that when that bill goes along, I think that it should be mandated that there should be $1 for preventative things, say the VHA, the VBA, military health service, etc. Um, and that goes with that one budget, because for so long we have decided that these things are going to be entirely separate, not only because the Department of Defense doesn't acknowledge things like moral injury, but it allows them to get war, to start wars, to start conflicts that lots of people are hurt in, not just Americans, but people all over the world. And then as far as the back end costs, those are shipped off to someone else, a different president, a different administration. And it becomes onto people like you guys to say, this is really what's actually happening. Bring it down from the abstract down to the concrete. This is what veterans are actually having to live for. Because something Danny says a lot is about that we have to make less veterans. Well, okay, I'm absolutely on board with that. In our journey in terms of making less veterans, that I feel we're more morally and ethically bound to make service better for people, to make it easier to like you said, Suzanne, that these are preventable harms. These are things that we actually can change. But part of it is we don't have the mindset for change. It takes so long to make small changes. And then a lot of times the bigger ones come with things like the Mission Act, stuff that says it's ostensibly to help, to give veterans more choice. And instead it is a way to help them less and to lessen the ability of the entirety of the VA to be able to help more veterans. I say that, I want to get that out there, because we've been forced to accept this dichotomy about where the money comes from and why we don't have it. People like to use the meme of the homeless veteran. I'm not going to help. We're not going to help anybody overseas until every homeless veteran has a place to stay. We need to latch on to the concrete, and we need to be front loading our expenses that way. And when and if that day actually comes, that people are going to have, well, this is okay. So you're saying that it's not $2, that the cost of this is not $2, but it's actually 3.5 or 3, however many trillion, whatever it is. And let the bean counters stew over that for a while. That they have to. It's not a choice anymore.
Thing that I like to see right now is the fact that
a lot of the armed forces are missing their recruiting goals, even though we're in a recession. And I find that really interesting because it just goes to show you that like young kids get it. Like they don't want to go into the military where they can deal with all this stuff because the information is getting out there. Like more
It is.
kids
Oh yeah.
are listening and really like, oh crap, I don't want to have that happen to me. Like, so it does make me feel good that like the Gen Z kids, like they get it. They're like, nope, I don't want to be a part of even the people that feel like, that there is an economic draft and like even those kids are still like, nope, it's not worth it because they're starting to understand and listen to the people who've gone through it and be like, oh, okay, I don't want to have to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm particularly incensed about is this whole, the bad paper discharges. And I think, if you ask most Americans know like zero, I would say, about, military service or the VA or, I mean, I, always give talks and did you know, did you know, did you know? And mostly they don't. And most Americans think every veteran is covered by the VA. They have no idea that your health care depends on your education benefits that we promise depends on discharge status. They don't know anything about. I mean, I think they probably heard about an honorable discharge and a dishonorable discharge. I mean, this category so extraordinary. This other an honorable discharge, right? And where I mean, you can't use the term punitive discharge because that's like a term of art, right? But these punishing discharges where people are punished because they have PTSD or traumatic brain injury or whatever, and they came to formation twice late, or they weekend or whatever, or they reported military sexual trauma, and then they get kicked out of the military with this discharge that makes it impossible for them to have um um you know healthcare and benefits. And Danny really explained to me how the military uses those, to kind of get rid of what he calls problem children, because it doesn't want to take the time to go through the medical discharge process, the lengthy medical discharge process, where then these commanders or whatever would have, you know, like non-deployable people on their books, which counts against them, et cetera. And I mean, I just think that's absolutely outrageous. And I mean, I don't know, I mean, did you know about that? And up? I mean, did they tell you about that? Did you register it when you were 18? And, I mean, because I bet you that's like a pretty big surprise to people. And then, the other thing that I think is so fascinating is how the VSOs won't let, AMVEX, the Legion, the DAV, um, um, VFW, you can't be a member if you have one of these bad paper discharges, right?
Mhm.
So they're not on board for changing this because they have the same mindset, right? And we have 600,000 people, right, who have these discharges and can't get help from the VA, can't get the benefits that were promised them. And the American people are like stunned. People are stunned when we tell them that.
Yeah,
Um,
my friend was a JAG officer in the Marine Corps, and a lot of what he did were fighting for people's discharges. And the thing that he told me was the most frustrating is the fact that you can do everything right and then have one mistake, and then it's up to the commander, basically, like what your discharge is. And if they just want to make an example of somebody, they can't. And then boom, there go all your benefits.
right.
And I just found that like so frustrating as someone who works, like my job right now is I work with homeless veterans who don't have honorable discharges. So like they didn't have enough time in, or they got discharged because they smoked pot once, and so it's frustrating because like if they were able to get seen by the VA, I could help them so much better. They would have so much better coordination of care. There would be so much more. It would just like their life would be so much easier if they were able to access these benefits, but they can't. And there is a way, to try to upgrade your discharge, but that takes forever and it's a long shot. Like most
There-
people don't get it.
Yeah, no, and the VA could also let them in, and there have been efforts. I mean, we have a great group in San Francisco called Swords to Plowshares, and
Yes.
then there's the Harvard Veterans Clinic, and they put a petition in 2015, like under Obama, right? And because the VA could let these people in. I mean, it's a long in the weeds discussion about, what was intended in 1944 with the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, you know, we don't want to spend, or Congress doesn't want to spend the itsy bitsy bit of money that it would take to bring 600,000 people, into the VA for what we promised them.
Mhm.
And, I think that, it was very interesting to talk to Michael Blecker, who is the executive director of Swords. And he basically said, he did not go to the traditional VSOs to get help with this because he thought they would actually fight against it. And I've had conversations. Sometimes I feel like civilians are more supportive of veterans than veterans are supportive of each other. I've had conversations with vets about people with bad papers, and they're like, well, those guys, they made bad choices. And you say, well, he had a traumatic brain injury. So, like, he really doesn't, have the cognitive ability to make a good choice. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. I didn't get an honorable discharge. So, I think there's also a lot of people who would be supportive of that, but people, it's a question of money, spending money, and we're willing to spend it on defective airplanes, that don't work, but we're not willing to spend it on treatments that we know will work for people that have served us. It's just infuriating.
It kind of points out a really tragic contradiction of the veterans healthcare system. One of the things that impressed me about it, learning more about it for the book, how it functions basically as a federal workers' compensation system, and it's 2/3 of the people who are VA patients have a disability rating. That's how service-related condition they've been able to prove, and so they're getting comprehensive health care coverage. They're in much better shape than a construction worker, a coal miner gets injured on the job, gets an occupational disease. Our state worker comp systems are not great. Employers have private insurers that fight the claims. The disability benefits in many states are pretty paltry. And, people are really wrapped up. They lose their job, they lose their regular job based health insurance, even if they case and get some treatment for their injury or their illness. Uh, in the VA, once people are in with a service related condition, they have comprehensive coverage. But, the one fly in the ointment is the military's treatment of the performance issues that can lead to disqualifying discharges. There's no way that a worker or a coal miner, if they get fired for punching a supervisor or smoking a joint on the job or going out on a wildcat strike, if a year later their employment has been terminated and they develop asbestosis or black lung disease, they can still apply for disability benefits. Their is not terminated as a result of their alleged misconduct on the job and their past termination by a private sector employer. So that's a big uh, uh, hole in the social safety net that benefits half of the 19 million Americans who've served in the military, and we're getting the benefit of VA services. And of course, we argue in the book. There's lots of ways that the VA coverage could and should be expanded to other veterans families, and people in the community who need this network of public hospitals and clinics, particularly in underserved areas of the country.
I was really uplifted to see your guys' commentary about um getting benefits to family members of veterans, that we have to start looking at it, that the family is included in this veteran circle that we put veterans into, because we bring it all home. We bring it and we essentially give it to our relatives. Um, but no, I think that that's a really amazing idea, and especially then that um one of the biggest issues, is facing Americans and certainly facing veterans that aren't able to get care from the VA is just simple health care. Losing your health care from, especially if it was a job that you had for a long time, and how that one thing can make someone spiral, have increasing depression, have other health issues, potentially contemplate suicide. They need to understand that how much these changes really matter to the few people that are able to get them. I think that all veterans should be able to access it. To me, it seems like something that would fall under equal protection of the law. That you How is it that you can prove that this one person's things, misconduct or whatever phrase, that it isn't driven by injuries that they received from the military? How can they, rubber stamp it as denied right out the gate simply on that basis?
Well, and I mean, I think that we are long time advocates of a national health system. I mean, I personally think it should be VA for all as opposed to Medicare for all, because the VA is a really great model. But the reality is that I mean, you see it in because so much of military since we did away with the draft, it's become sort of a family business. Dad was in Vietnam, I'm gonna whatever. And I mean, a lot of the folks that I've interviewed and veterans I've talked to and spent time with, their father was in, no, grandpa was in World War II and came back, never quite the same. And then, was in Vietnam and came back, and well, they had a name for the never quite the same, after a while, PTSD. And then they join up and this is a mental illness, and the wounds of war is kind of a gift that keeps on giving. And and then you add football into it, and they come in with like CTE, and it's really like a setup, I think. And as my friend Harold Cutler, who was the chief of mental health for the VA for a long time, said, I mean, if Joe has PTSD and he's married and he has kids, I mean, Joe doesn't just experience a PTSD or tinnitus or whatever, any of these problems, not to mention the burn pits and the birth defects and the cancers that you're passing along to your progeny. But it's ridiculous. And we should have both the VA. I mean, I personally think that the national health system a la VA, the VA should be part of that. And, vets could go to the VA, and their families could also go to the VA, or they could go, to get health care in this national system to which everyone would have access, like every other country, every other industrialized country. I mean, I think that veterans should be approached by healthcare reform activists to join in the struggle for national health care, and they should also really be joining the struggle for ending privatization. More vets should be of the VA, which because you need a specific healthcare system to deal with the very specific illnesses and conditions that veterans have. I mean, one of the things I learned writing Wounds of War was veterans have very specific healthcare problems, mental and physical and social, right? And you need a system that deals with that. As long as we're producing veterans, right? And obviously it would be great if we weren't, you have to have a healthcare system and a social determinants of health system that deals with the very specific problems that veterans have. Um, and I think that that system should fit into a larger system to which we all have access. And every vet, no matter what their age, no matter where they have a proven service connected disability, should be given that health care because we can afford it. I mean, one of the things that really, really impressed me in writing Wounds of War in this book as well is the socialization in the military of embracing the suck, of not having health, not, I mean, even when you have the military health system, not using it. Cause like, as the Marines say, pain is weakness leaving the body. I mean, really like, and I have talked to people who had horrendous injuries and didn't, there's no paper trail because you're socialized not to go to the doctor. I mean, unless I was told, unless a broken bone that's like sticking out of skin and bleeding, or, you're told not to get help. And so you socialize people into this anti-health seeking behavior. And then they don't have a paper trail. They can't prove the service connected disability, and then they can't get into the VA. And if that is the frame, then you absolutely must give these people access to healthcare without demanding some kind of paper trail that proves, that they got this.
Think of it a simple the best use of extending the system that way, that it is that in terms of, as we understand more about how multi-generational trauma and combat get mixed together, that in that paradigm, you would be ensuring that, not just the veteran who goes to combat, but the veteran who doesn't go to combat and the family members and the kids and in that way, but that whole sphere of influence that a veteran has, at least they're protected
Right.
healthcare wise. And that's something that they could go forward with that. Like I would think like my sons should have like VA coverage at least for like the mental health aspect because their dad has issues that way. That it just makes logical sense. But I think the biggest problem we're going to run into is that people don't expand their idea that big enough because they want people, as Americans, we're supposed to, what you were just talking about, Suzanne, we're supposed to suck it up. We're not supposed to, and that by asking, we're somehow relinquishing, that John Wayne cowboy bullshit. When in reality, we're just trying to deal with the aftermath of war in all the different forms that it ends up taking and all the people that it ends up, dealing with.
I mean, there's some pretty interesting models, for that kind of expansion. I mean, we argue in the book that let's begin by covering every veteran, okay? I mean, let's get rid of any means tests for income or service connection or discharge status, I mean, I don't know. Okay, I'm willing to compromise on dishonorable discharges, maybe because there's so few of those people, right? But everybody else is in, nobody's out. We're there, okay? And then once we've got that, then I think we should expand it to family members. I mean, I think we should expand it to VA caregivers. There's 3,000 caregivers who have devoted their lives to helping vets, and 100,000 of them are vets. Okay, fine. Not every one of those 100,000 vets has, can make it to the eligibility made. But, I have friends who are, primary care docs and psychologists and psychiatrists, these amazing models of care. They can't get care in the system they've created, and they have to go out into the private sector where the care is fragmented and disorganized, and they can't get the kind of models of care that they've pioneered. Insane. That would be 200,000 people. So, bring all vets in, VA caregivers. Let's start there, then expand to family members. And, you can even expand to communities. I mean, in White River, Vermont, um, at the VA, they've let in because they have such a problem with mental health care in the area. They have let civilian sector patients come into the VA to get care. That's very,
Yes.
you know, doable. And they're arguing now, the powers that be in Washington, oh, we can't really afford the VA healthcare system. There's a declining veteran population. Some of these are underutilized, blah, blah, blah. Well, you could bring in increased utilization by bringing in vets who are currently in these priority groups, difficult for them to get care. You could bring their family members in. You could bring community members in, because in all of these places where they want to shut down VAs, there are terrible shortages of healthcare, particularly in rural America. And the VA could really use its fourth mission, which is something that almost nobody knows about, which is to serve as a backup for the broader healthcare system in times of regional, national, or local emergency. It could expand its fourth mission and bring folks like family members in, community members in. It's very doable. It's very cost effective, because the VA is a cost effective system because it's mission, not profit driven.
I think it's interesting. There's a housing program called HUD-VASH. It's the VA Supported Housing Group grant, and they have recently changed the criteria within the last couple of years to let more people in that have bad paper or at least general under honorable
Yeah.
conditions, and also length of service has been decreased drastically. So now basically anybody who made it past 2 weeks can get enrolled in VASH, and I think that that's going to be a good crack in the way of letting
Right.
people open it, because that's the next question of like, there's always this continuity of care with veterans. So if we're going to let these people who have these other than honorable or general under honorable conditions, folks in, or folks who didn't serve the full 180 days, if we're going to let them in, we might as well let them have VA healthcare. So I know that's like, there are people out there that are trying to push that, but it's good because now we're seeing that there's a balance. Like, there are folks out there who are fighting for this because they realize we're in a need. We have a national crisis of homelessness, and we need to do something about it. So I don't know. I think that's going to be interesting to see how it develops over the next couple of years.
I
Yeah.
mean, the biggest threat to all of this forward motion and the possibility of improvements and expansion of coverage is the defunding that's been going on for the last 7 years under the Choice and now the Mission Acts. And, VA Secretary McDonough's latest figures are pretty daunting. You've got a HA direct care budget of about 100 billion a year. 33% of that is now being diverted to reimbursement of private hospital chains, private medical practices, and private clinics, all of the private healthcare industry interests that are feeding at the trough. So a third of the budget now is the VA is essentially functioning as a Medicare style reimbursement of outsources. And this privatization trend is accelerating. McDonough has admitted that it's now on track to consume 50% of the VA budget. So where does that leave the 9 million patients and their families, who depend on that network of 1,200 medical centers and clinics, if half the money allocated for direct care is being diverted to unnecessary outside referrals to providers skill and experience treating veterans, to provide
So,
quicker
um,
access, which was how this thing was sold to the VSOs and to many veterans as a form of choice. And it's not sustainable. McDonough has admitted that, but he regards the situation as healthy competition. Well, I'm a Kaiser member in California. Kaiser's got a similar number of patients. nine, 10 million is the VA. Kaiser doesn't tell me, hey, Steve, if you got a medical problem, anytime you want, just go to Sutter, go to UCSF, go to Stanford, any one of our competitors, and you can be treated there. You can self-refer. Just send the bill to us. That's not how it works. You
Right.
can't go out of network without penalties. So veterans have been told, be patients, and many get this and know that it doesn't add up. That you can have your cake and you can eat it too. Well, you can't because they're cannibalizing the system. They're defunding it and they're setting it up for the kind of dismantling and downsizing the Biden administration itself proposed a few months ago. Fortunately, that particular restructuring scheme was torpedoed as a result of grassroots organizing by the patients and their caregivers and some of the VSOs. And, key senators said, no, we're not going to have an air commission to implement this plan, but they're going to find other ways to implement the plan piecemeal because unless they stop the outsourcing. And McDonough so far has failed to do that. And he has 2 more years left on his watch. But he is on the same trajectory as the Trump and Obama administration VA secretaries before him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that's really important for people to understand is that it's not just the Republicans that privatization bandwagon. I mean, it's really the corporate Democrats who are being, one of the points that our colleague Jasper Craven makes is that the Senate and House Veterans Affairs Committee used to be kind of backwaters because nobody would give them money, nobody would give them donations because there was, they weren't in the service of private interests. And now there's huge amount of lobbyists and huge amount of money going in to the coffers of of these senators and congressmen who Congress people, excuse me, who are really, going along with the privatization agenda. I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida is a huge recipient of hospital industry money. The Dems are probably not getting money from the Koch brothers, but they're getting money from the pharmaceutical industry that hates the fact that the VA negotiates prescription drug prices. They're getting money from the hospital industry, the medical equipment industry that wants a cut, of this huge pot of gold, $100 billion pot of gold. And we really need to put pressure on the Dems. We really need to put pressure on the Biden administration because they have pursued Trump era policies. And they have 2 years, the 2 years guaranteed, right, where they can reverse these, often by rulemaking, right? I mean, the Secretary of the VA can reverse the privatization and outsourcing through this Mission Act, through rulemaking and changing access standards that Trump's VA Secretary Wilkie engineered. And he will not, he says he won't do it. He could reverse this human resources. Trump initiated a human resources modernization plan that has essentially crippled VA hiring and that McDonough is pursuing. There's all kinds of ways that without any legislation whatsoever, the secretary can use his authority to reverse outsourcing. And I think veterans groups and veterans and their families, it's not just the vet, right? I mean, the vet
He
has
could also fire Trump's favorite medical information processing firm, Cerner, which got a $15 million no bid contract, which has screwed up VA medical record keeping in just about every place that it has been introduced. They've now paused the rollout, but this is another contractor that should not have gotten that contract. Actually, the work probably could have been done better in-house. Uh, but it's a huge albatross around the neck of the current VA administration, again, inherited from Trump, but they're going to have to deal with it. Just staying the course is not in the best interest of veterans or their families.
It It reminds me of uh, our discussion about abortion access in understanding that Biden and the Biden administration can take much bigger strides than it is, and it's choosing not to. Um, so keeping in mind, of course, that the VHA rule about them not being able to compete properly in terms of market based salaries for hiring. Um, that it just we're seeing this. You mentioned about an albatross around the VA's neck. You know that we're from our last conversation, Suzanne, from sometime in 2019, I think that it was certainly smaller, but we're starting. The monster's fins are really out there now. We're really starting to see the snowball gather speed, and um, what will the VA look like in 20 or 25 years? And that's not really, long-term planning at all. And yet we still need it. There's been some numbers running around in the news recently about that they anticipate the population of veterans to drop like precipitously, like by a third within a shorter amount of time. And I can see it already being used as fodder to say, "Yep, we're just wasting. It's a waste of money." And of course, let guys choose what they want to, but no one has this kind of conversation understanding the continuity of care that the VA provides, and that they do provide something that other doctors cannot. It's not just some axiom that we came up with just to do that. They actually do provide that, and especially like you guys are talking about that the kind of conditions that veterans have frequently and how those conditions work with one another.
Well, one of the things that folks don't understand about healthcare is you can have a declining patient population and still have an increase in need because, veterans have very complex, they have multiple issues. I mean, the average over 65-year-old who goes, on Medicare has 3 to 5 presenting problems. The average Vietnam vet has 9 to 12. So, and the folks who, veterans have more muscular skeletal problems. I mean, this doesn't even depend on combat. I mean, you don't have to go to
Sure.
combat, right? They have more toxic exposures. They again, combat, yes, but there's other toxic exposures. They have more mental health problems. They have more suicide risks. They have more PTSD, et cetera, et cetera. So they come in as very complex patients, and then they get more complex as they age because added on to those problems is the normal health conditions of aging. They have more diabetes, they have more hypertension, et cetera, et cetera. You can have fewer vets, but that doesn't mean, but if fewer vets have more problems, they still have a lot of it. If
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
and you're and if you're talking, you have these facilities and you have these models of care that have been developed that the taxpayer, we have to think about this as an investment, right? We have invested in this infrastructure for 70 years, and it's an amazing return on investment that tragically nobody knows how much money they made, how much rewards they have reaped. And many of these clinical innovations benefit us all. I mean, VA teaches 70% of American physicians in training. It teaches 50% of psychologists. It does amazing research, et cetera, that benefits all Americans. Every vet that gets treated in the VA, there's a ripple effect. I mean, I have a friend whose brother was a Vietnam vet, and she said to me, if the VA weren't there, I would have never been able to become like a professor in this, prestigious university because I would have been dealing with, he would have been homeless. He would have had all these mental problems that she, as his sister, would have had to deal with. So, we're not assessing, I think, and the VA certainly doesn't promote this enough, the amazing ripple effect that this system produces a benefit for the good of Americans. And I think that we need to expand the system. I personally think we need to go on you know, the offensive. I mean, I helped found a group called the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute and work for it now. And we firmly believe that we have to have a positive, not just a defensive vision of both veterans and also, what the Department of Veterans Affairs can do, not only for veterans, but their families, their communities, and all Americans. And, one of the things that I'd like to also say is that the media plays such a pernicious role in all this. I mean, the media focuses on the vets from January 6th, and the mass shooters and so forth and so on. It never focuses on, where are you guys when they need sources? Where are the folks in common defense, Veterans for Peace? There are all kinds of candidates for local office. Steve can speak to this, who are progressive vets. They never make it into the mainstream media. And so we have this very skewed view of American veterans as kind of, white supremacists, blah, blah, blah. And obviously there are some. I mean, there are mass shooters, there are white supremacists, but there's a whole spectrum of political opinion in veterans that never make it into the media because the media is so fundamentally conservative itself.
Well, the in dealing with the back and forth for towards the movement of privatization, that what is it? 2/3 of the federal workforce are veterans. A huge proportion of the people that work at the VA, and so that even for people that aren't actively seeking out the care, there are that or that are involved in providing it, and certainly can speak to how well it does, how it helps the people that they see, and how that those veterans are trying to continue their own work of service. 'Cause I'm sure. I mean, working at the VA is not it's not an easy job.
And
Um,
the other major federal employer of veterans, is the Postal Service. And there's
the,
a parallel uh, Trump, now Biden administration, push for privatization. There's more than 100,000 veterans as a result of hiring preferences become members of the various postal unions. They, like their counterparts in the VA unions, are on the front lines of a major anti-privatization struggle to try to prevent a Trump appointee, Louis DeJoy, who's the Postmaster General, still under Biden. They haven't gotten rid of him yet. And he has a Postal Service restructuring plan that would severely undermine uh, the mail delivery, cut tens of thousands of jobs, and it's incremental privatization that's not in the interest of the public that needs its mail ballots delivered promptly, that it's not in the interest of the communities that are served by rural post offices, it's not in the interest of the uh, many people of color, including veterans, who've been able to get good, steady, long-term employment as postal workers, benefits, healthcare coverage, chance of a decent pension. So people want to help veterans at this point. One of the major things they can do is get behind these two parallel anti-privatization struggles to try to stop the outsourcing and dismantling of the veterans healthcare system and the U.S. mail system, another form of public provision that benefits uh, hundreds of millions of us and will not be replaced for the better by private delivery companies.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the heartening things for us has been the struggle against the Air Commission and the closures of VA hospitals and the unions that have, like American Federation of Government Employees, National Nurses United, and unions and veterans groups all over the country that have really attacked that proposal. And that was a very big victory. I mean, these people are hydra headed, I guess, or, they never disappear. But we can really have a big effect when veterans work together with, unions and civic groups and so forth. And I'm very proud of the role that Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute played, and we worked a lot with AFGE, and um, it's very promising, I think. And I think that it's just very important for veterans to understand that you cannot have you cannot maintain the integrity of the Veterans Healthcare Administration, the Veterans Healthcare system, if you're not using it, right? The taxpayer is not going to pay $100 billion a year for buildings and personnel that nobody goes to. And so veterans, I think, need to really speak with each other and encourage each other to go to the VHA. I mean, I did a radio show recently with a woman who was a vet, and she doesn't use the VA healthcare system. She said, because, I don't want to take money from people who need it more than me. And I said, wait a minute. The VA budget, and a lot of people believe this, the VA budget depends on prior utilization. They look at how many people used it last year and the year before, and then they, add some incremental, they figure out how many people might be using it. And that's how they develop the budget. So if you don't use the VA, you're actually taking it away. It's not like they Hagen and Henry decide which one of them is going to use the VA, and that's how they make the budget. And so there's so many misconceptions about, what the VA is about. I mean, one of the other things is, they just want to give you pills. I can't tell you how many vets I've heard that from. They just want to give you pills. Actually, no, they don't. I mean, obviously they'll give you pills if you need it. Kagan, maybe you can speak to this, but but they have talk therapy, they have meditation. I learned how to meditate with a bunch of Vietnam vets at the VA. I went to a course, and it got to be, where's Suzanne? How come you weren't here last week? It was just great. And they have acupuncture, they have salsa dancing, they have cooking classes. I mean, you know, uh, literally there was a program in San Diego to prevent homelessness in Iraq and Afghanistan vets, and they taught them salsa dancing to teach about socialization. I don't think Sutter does salsa dancing. And or Providence in Oregon. It's really a remarkable system, and I think vets should do more talking to vets about, get help, go to the VA, right? As opposed to, oh no, they just want to give you pills, or they make you want to talk, and just go online and chat with your buddies online. I mean, it's good to chat with your buddies online, but unless your buddies are all psychologists, if you have PTSD, might not be so helpful.
There can be a lot of fear that comes with trying to pursue uh, healing in whatever form it happens to be, and hopefully once those guys who haven't tried, or maybe they had an experience or a few experiences at the VA that did not,
Right.
it didn't work out for them, then I hope they go back. I hope they try again. Um, yeah, no, I can't imagine the medical debt that I would be in if I did not have access to the VA. It absolutely has kept me in much better health than I would be under any other kind of HMO system. I can't even imagine. Before we close up, I wanted to touch on something that we had talked about before before we had started. That a couple days ago, we released an episode on abortion access and reproductive freedom in the military. But one aspect that actually made some notes about it, but I didn't get to share it, on how the VA's policies actually deal with those kind of things, and that the VA does provide a bit of a stopgap as far as for veterans needing that kind of care. Would you guys please share with us about that?
Sure. So that in given the Supreme Court decision and these draconian bans on abortion in various states, the VA secretary announced a rule that the VA would provide abortions in cases of rape, incest, or the health, the danger to the life of the mother. And that is very narrow, but it's a very in a very good move in the right direction. And there have been legal opinions, notably from the um, Vet Voice Foundation, where they've looked at and said that they could expand these rights to provide abortions for, broader reasons. And I think it's really important to understand that women veterans have a lot of serious problems with risks for pregnancy. They have more hypertension, they have more cardiac problems. Burn pit exposure creates a lot of risks, and they get, certainly risk for cancer. And you don't want a woman veteran to be facing the choice of having to have a baby and then dying because they couldn't get cancer treatment, et cetera. And so I think that the VA should be pushed to broaden access to abortions in these particular states where you're not allowed to um, have them. And also, I personally think that you could argue that the VA could expand its fourth mission to bring in women who are facing a medical emergency. If they've, for example, had a miscarriage and doctors refuse to give them appropriate care following a miscarriage because they're afraid, that this will be considered to be, related to abortions or whatever. So this is, I mean, the McDonough, um, I applaud his move to expand it in this narrow range. I think they have to be pushed to expand it even further, and also to expand their fourth mission, because for women in these states, I mean, women who wanted to have babies and had a miscarriage and then they can't get appropriate follow-up care and their lives are put at risk and their reproductive futures are put at risk. This is just crazy. Or women who have cancer, and they have to choose between chemotherapy. I mean, they can't get an abortion, So the VA, I think, is tiptoeing in to playing an important role, and it should be encouraged to play an even bigger role.
Yeah, there's also the uh, getting care to trans folks and non-binary folks as well. Um, but yeah, um, it's sad to me that those are the kind of things that we have to find for positive stuff. But it is a step in the right direction, and it's a very I think a very powerful one. Um, I I think that's probably a good spot for us to wrap it up for today. Um, is there any other topics or anything you guys want to end on? Um,
Well, listeners who are interested in ordering a copy of our veterans can do so through your favorite local unionized bookstore up there in Portland, Powell's. You can order it online. Don't go to Amazon. Uh, that famously hypocritical example of performative patriotism in the corporate America. You can also order the book directly from the publisher, Duke University Press, also recently unionized by my union, the CWA News Guild. You can go to our website, ourvetsbook.com, and there's an ordering button there that goes back to Duke. So we hope people check out the book and let other people know about it because, it took some lobbying to find a publisher to tell this story. And it'll be much harder next time if we don't reach certain sales target figures. And it's not for our benefit. Believe me, we're not John Grisham making big money off a book about veterans. It's for the cause, it's for the movement, it's for the campaigns. And hopefully we're making a contribution to all of them writing this.
And I also wanted to suggest that if people are interested in following these veterans' health issues and benefits issues, they should check out the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute, which is veteranspolicy.org. And subscribe to the newsletter or just check out the website because we're constantly tracking this stuff. I think we're pretty much one of the only groups that is really kind of on this 24/7, and I really salute my colleagues there, and Jasper Craven, who is one of the co-authors, works with me at VHPI as well.
I've found that site to be a wonderful resource.
Thank
Yeah, no, it is, and I'm so thankful that even if you were the only person or VHPI or the only people really minding the store as far as these issues go, thank goodness that it's there. You know,
Mhm.
and I know last time you and I talked, Suzanne, it was, a wonderful discussion. And I feel like once again, with alongside Wounds of War, that, you guys have broken ground on stuff that people are going to kind of slap their foreheads and like, how did I not know about this? How did I not see this? And I hope that lots of people do. I hope that they do. And there's so much that I learned that was in the book about these issues. So thank you, Steve and Suzanne, for joining us. I hope everybody does try to pick up a copy of Our Veterans. I'll make sure that I have a good link for that in our show notes. Go back to your guys' website and to our good local bookseller. Will make people who live in the East Coast have to go buy it from Powell's. That will be our Portland revenge.
And we'll see you in Portland in March, hopefully.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that would be great. Please keep us apprised of that, and thank you, listeners, for joining us today. And we will see you next time. Take care. Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks: Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Rick Coffey, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, and the Status Quo podcast. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain